Hello, and welcome to Painting with Freehand Lines. Today's view is a painting of Regent's Canal. To paint this scene, we'll be using something quite unusual. As well as the standard brushes, we'll also be using a Stanley knife and paints such as reds and orange and blue, darkened with Payne's grey, which is on the right, and of course the usual yellows, my favourite yellows, yellow ochre, burnt umber and raw umber for darkening. So let's begin. This is a kind of late summer autumnal scene, so we're going to start by filling in some of those lovely browns and adding a little bit of the olive green to the mix to really start to get those vibrant yellows out of the actual trees. Remember, as a water scene, the water will reflect, almost like a mirror, what's above. So as you paint, a good idea is to try and replicate the paint below. This doesn't need to be exact, but needs to just be approximately similar in its shape and form. While that dries, this is a good time to paint the boats. Canal boats are really great because the colours tend to be quite vibrant, so you can really have fun here. So I'm using a kind of quite a bright red, just filling in the gaps. And the other boats I'll use complementary colours as well. This is really useful to do a painting like this rather than architecture, because you have to be less careful with the colours in terms of getting them right. You can really have much more fun painting these sorts of scenes. the stone bridge at the back, we will use yellow ochre and a bit of burnt umber to just darken it. And remember, as with the boats and the trees, we need to replicate in the water the similar form. This is quite important with the arch in the distance, because later on that will be the view through. So we need to get that a bit carefully rounded to create almost like a circle. Some more brown around where the wall is behind the canal. Now we've done the yellow in the trees, we can now go onto the olive green, the pure olive green, and you can see the difference here between the yellow with just a slight amount of browny olive green in it compared to the olive green itself. As we often do with these paintings, we go from light to dark. So I'm now adding this layer of darkness in, and we'll add some more colours as we go to really make the greenery quite vibrant and mixed. a touch of Payne's grey added to the olive green, which creates a darker colour now, just to start to break those shadows in, the drooping foliage in the foreground. Note when doing detailed work where there's lots of different layers of colour, you end up doing these little striations of colour in between colours, working on one side, flipping to the other, and then going back again to give the paint time to dry so it doesn't all bleed into one another. The simplest way to paint is not to try and do the wet painting, which is really impressive, but actually to layer paints one at a time. You have complete control then and can create really quite complex and nuanced paintings rather than wet sketches. So this is a really good process to use. You can also play with it. For example, as I just did then, I actually added some wet paint onto another piece of wet paint, controlling it, and that allows a limited amount of bleed between the two paints. Now we've almost finished the first coat. Really, the painting is full of colours, very few little white bits, so I can now start adding more darks onto the dried paint. Here, starting to get the shadows of that drooping foliage in the foreground, but also then getting a slightly darker brown, still yellow ochre, but just a little bit of grey or brown in there just to darken it, and starting to add that too. Adding the shadows to the bridge now, really important one this, that really gives a focal point. Always good to have a focal point, some element that stands out in the distance, that draws your eye in and makes you believe there's something behind the painting of interest. Beginning again to add layers of shadow using some of that dark paint I've got on my brush just to darken the entrance around there and blend it in a little bit more to the shadows below. And now, interesting point now, I want to try and get rid of some of those little white bits, so I'm going to add bits of just a light wash of yellow ochre, and this will start to obviously dissolve some of the paint underneath and bleed the paints into one another. This is part of what I mentioned earlier about having control about the paint. We've laid it up carefully, and now we can actually play and dissolve some of it. And then onto the water. Now the water will reflect exactly what's above, but quite often the water is darker because it's darker underneath. So the best way to replicate this in paint is to use a big brush and take a light wash of Payne's Grey and just wash over the entirety of the base. That just gives it all a darker tone. And then what we'll do is darken the edges a bit more. So once that's kind of dry, I'm starting now to bring the darker bits to the edges a bit more. These are specifically where a larger object is blocking the light from reflecting in the foreground. So, and on this case, the boat and the drooping foliage above is doing that job. So bringing this in creates a surface, almost like a surface on top, like a shadow on top of an object. This further reinforces the water as this plane, this separate entity at the base of the painting, and then continuing by working up the shadows on the boats. Now using the splayed brush to create the sort of delicate edges around the actual bits of the trees in order to blend it in and just add that little bit of detail. In terms of colours, I tend to prefer using tubes, and that's because I can get an intensity of colour, because I like to use the whole range of colours from dark to light. And you can see here I've just used kind of a darker green, and now I'm using quite a bright yellow actually over the top, and you can see the effect the bright yellow is having. It's really lifting and giving much more vivid colours, just quite autumnal, that'll feel like the actual sunlight reflecting on yellow leaves. By adding layers like this over and over paint, you can create some fantastic effects. Really quite beautiful, and you can experiment with different colours. You don't need to use yellow, you could add a little bit of red or orange in there. It will really start to blend in with the trees and create something quite vivid and exciting. Time to add more shadows on the bridge and show the edge of the end of the bridge or the light above. On the water side, now just dotting that a little bit, because of acknowledging that light will actually reflect more on darker elements. That's a really nice trick to create some realism. And then starting as well to add the shadows around the edge of the bank to reinforce the idea this is water. So adding shadows around the edge a bit darker really does help create that water effect. And then going to create the deep shadows underneath the trees that would have been around the actual edge of the banks, remembering to reflect those in the water again. Another good use of the splayed or fan brush is once you put some paint on and you need to blend it in, you can actually do that really easily with this brush. It's a great brush. And I keep a few different sizes. Actually, the smaller ones tend to be more useful, but it's good to get a few different sizes of these kind of brushes. Now it's autumn and there's going to be leaves around, and this is quite still water, so there's going to be debris on top of the water. So what I'm going to do is use just a little bit of the yellow, intense yellow, to put some some leaves on there. There's different ways of doing this. This is the simplest way. You can buy something called masking fluid, which is a little white paint you dot on, and that's like a rubber solution. It dries and you paint your watercolour over the top, and then you can rub it out afterwards and it leaves a little gap, and then you can put the paint on. And it's great stuff. It takes a little bit of planning and preparation. I like to keep it a bit rawer than that and just go for it and work the composition as I go. So I may do a video showing how to use the Frisk. It's not something I use very often, but it may be of use. So maybe one to pick up another time. And now for the fun bit. Flat water will have glistens of light on it, and that's a very hard thing to do watercolour, to leave little bits of white. You could use a masking fluid, as I mentioned, but that's very, very kind of tight and a bit sloppy. So here I'm actually just going to take a Stanley knife and I'm just going to attack the surface of paper, drawing left and right. As the knife sticks into the paper, it will create a scratch with larger sort of tears, and that creates this fantastic kind of idea of sparkling light on the water. Keeping the strokes always horizontal so it feels like it is a surface. It's a very dramatic effect, and this is what I love about watercolours. Don't ever treat them with too much respect. It's really good to have fun. It's good to pour a lot of colour on there. It's good to squirt water using a pipette or dropper, and it's good to just actually scratch and attack the surface to create the right painting for you. So this is kind of one of the last finishing touches, and all of a sudden you can start to feel that water. You can almost jump into it. So a really great way to use tools such as knives in creating a great, beautiful piece of art. And we are almost finished. Another great painting, and one unusual one because it's not architecture, it's boats on water. And when you zoom in and look at these kind of effects, people will really, really appreciate the kind of quality and the ability in creating it. And there you have it, a really beautiful painting, quite vivid colours, and something to be proud of. Thank you.